When the Apostle Paul wrote to the church of Gentile brethren in Colossae, there are some Jewish brethren that have come in and started teaching false doctrine. So let's see what he says. He says to these Gentiles in Colossians 2:11, you, speaking to Gentiles, were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, so not physical, but spiritual. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food or drink or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of things to come. He says, why do you submit yourselves to decrees, regulations such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, things that were destined to perish? So the purpose of this study is to lead us to a better understanding of God's laws, both permanent and those that were destined to perish, so that we can see what applies to us today. I think that's so important. So our questions: what laws were given, were all laws that were given after that garden? You know, the instruction in the garden, do not touch or eat that tree. After that, were all laws given still binding today? Everything that God told people, are they still binding today? If not, how can we tell the difference? What is and what is not binding today? We're going to read about laws that were nailed to the cross. Are those permanently done away with? And what is included for us both to do and to teach today to others? So our Bible here, we're going to start here. This Bible that I have, that you have, part of it is inspired and part of it is not. So before you get upset, it's the words that are inspired, that are the words of God. But there's other things that are included in our modern day Bibles that are not inspired, and it can influence the way we understand. You look at our Bibles, we have numbering on the verses, that's man-made. The chapter divisions, that's man-made. The notes, if yours has notes, the dates, any of that is man-made. That is not inspired. Even the Old Testament division and the New Testament division. Even the title, Old Testament, New Testament, is not inspired. Even the way that the Bible is compiled into sections and put together is not inspired. So all of that can hurt even our understanding of what God's trying to get across. The term Old Testament is not a word we use today, but maybe a better one is covenant, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And that is what is included in both of these sections. But when we see terms like Jesus is the blood of the New Testament or covenant, and that he is the mediator of the new covenant, and that people that now are supposed to be teachers, ministers of the new covenant, then it's confusing when Paul wrote about abolishing the law of commandments, the decrees that were nailed on the cross, and that's confusing. Okay, well, if he nailed some laws on the cross, does that mean then that this old covenant was nailed to the cross, Genesis through Malachi? Was the entire Old Testament nailed to the cross? Does that mean that we're not under that, so why study that today? Do you understand where we're going? That can misunderstand the very wording that man has added to our Bible, can cause confusion with us. Why study anything of the Old Testament? Well, Paul, some 35 years later, after laws were nailed to Jesus' cross, 35 or so years later, Paul wrote to a young man, Timothy, and he said that from childhood you have known the sacred writings, which are able to lead you to salvation through Jesus Christ. Wait a minute now. So you're talking about the Old Testament The parts of the Old Testament are able to lead Timothy, so therefore us to salvation. Okay, we got to break this down. Let's get this broken down. What is he talking about? And I hope at the end of today's sessions that you will have a better understanding of that. I sure hope so. And my prayer is that I'm very faithful to his word, that I do not add or take away from it. So that's what we're going to get into. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's go back to Genesis. God, he tells right off the bat his creation and his creation of man and how man sinned. He went against certain laws. And then he goes on and we're going to back up in a minute, but he goes on past the garden and there's other people that come and go. And we see that some are favorable to God. They're in his favor. They're faithful, and then others are going to be punished. Well, how did they know what to do? How did they know what to do? Did God give them laws? If so, what were those laws? And how did God give them the laws? How did he make known to them these laws? Okay, so let's go back again to Adam. God told Adam. He told Adam. When he put him in that garden, he said, cultivate it, keep it. Any tree of the garden you may eat freely from, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree, yes, of good and evil, you may not eat that. So that's just basic laws. And then it says Eve is made. It doesn't say God told Eve. He had told Adam already. And Adam evidently told his wife Eve because she's aware of it. Because when the serpent comes along, she tells him. She repeats those, didn't she? So she knew the laws, and when they both broke those laws, they were both expelled from the garden. Both of them. Let's leave the garden now. And there was grandchildren and great-grandchildren and all of that. And people began to populate the earth. And so we get to Genesis 6. And God said that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. You see this widespread wickedness now. But Noah found favor. So this comparison, those who did not find favor and the ones who did find favor. Noah. So question, after Adam and Eve left the garden, were there additional laws given? Were there more laws given? When we read through the Bible, we read of God's prophets. When God speaks to a man or a woman, and they are his prophet, they will be as God to someone else. That's what God told Moses, one of his prophets. You will be as God to them. So he's not going to speak to every person. He will speak to certain people, and they will be his mouthpieces, his prophets. So let's go back and cover a few of them. Abel. It says in Genesis, now what we're going to do is we're going to see that we're going to read certain accounts, and then God will inspire another person later to tell us an additional information about an earlier account. So in Genesis, we read of a man named Abel, Adam and Eve's child. He gives of the firstlings of his flock and the fat portions. That's exactly what God will have Moses write down for the Israelites many hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years later. The same terminology. Did he just happen to know that? Well, Jesus later, so thousands of years later, when Jesus is talking about his prophets, in Luke 11, he will talk about the murder of his prophets from Abel to Zechariah. And in the Hebrew Bible, Zechariah was the last murdered prophet in their Hebrew Old Testament. So Abel is a prophet, and God spoke to Abel. Abel knew exactly what to do. He did it, but his brother, instead of going out and get the first fruits, he got some of the produce of the land and offered that to God. He did not do what his brother had instructed him to do. Are you following me? Is that fairly clear to you? So Abel is a prophet of God. Let's go to the next one, Enoch. In the Old Testament, in Genesis, it simply says that he walked with God. But we get more information at the end of the New Testament when God inspires Jude, and Jude said that Enoch was a prophet. So it's interesting how God will send different information. That's how it's going to help us piece together all of this about the original questions. Noah built this ark. He spent all this time building the ark, but it's not until God inspires Peter, also at the end of the New Testament, that we see, even though everybody was so wicked, and here's this man building this ark to save he and his family, we find out at the end of the Bible that the whole time Noah was there, he was preaching. He was a preacher of righteousness. And for him to be able to preach meant God had spoken to him, or at least he had the information. So here is a man that the whole time had been preaching. Why? Because God is long-suffering. He is patient with us, Peter says, not willing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. So God is giving the whole wicked world time to repent. God, the creator of everything, revealed his words to man through his prophets so that man was not ignorant of God's laws. And the purpose is to bring peace between us and our God. That's why he gives this information. Then came idolatry. At some time, the created being decides he rejects the God who made him, in his words, and he comes up, oh, look at that sun. Oh, the moon is pretty impressive. I think I'll bow down to them. Or he makes up images in his own mind and takes the work of his hand. Maybe it's a piece of wood and carves it or forges metal. And he comes up with idols. He gives it their own characteristics, their own rules, and they worship that instead. Now, before the flood, I personally do not find anything about idolatry, except perhaps in Genesis chapter 4:22. Cain, one of the descendants of Cain, God is giving the descendants of Cain, and one of them is Tubal-Cain. And it says he's the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, like what we see up here. Bronze and iron. Perhaps that's why God put that in there. But it's really not until later, when they start repopulating the earth after the flood, then when that repopulation of the earth happens, you start reading of idolatry. Then comes along in chapter 12, God introduces us to a man of favor, a righteous man. His name is Abram or Abraham. And we don't read of it in Genesis, but we read of it later when God inspires Joshua, that hundreds of years later. He said that Abram forsook the idols of his family. Do you see that? How there's idolatry all around, but here's this man that forsook these idols. And God chose him. He's going to bless all the world through this man, Abraham. Puts a different picture a little bit on it, doesn't it? He forsook the idols of his family. He turned to the Creator, and God is going to choose his family. So this righteous Abraham, it will be through his seed that God will bless the whole world. We know that he had Isaac, and then he had Jacob, and it's through his grandson Jacob, when God chose him, that he renamed him Israel, and that his descendants will now be the Israelites. And it will be through that family that God will bring blessings to everyone, to us included. When God promised Abraham that he would give these descendants a land, why did he not just give them the land? Do you remember there were people living in the land? There were already people living in this promised land, and God said their iniquity is not yet complete. The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And like I said earlier, God is long-suffering, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. He knows there will come a time, because he's an all-knowing God, and there will come a time when their iniquity is complete, and then God will give them the land, but not yet. They're going to have to wait. So I want us to look at some others in this waiting period, this early part of people who knew his law. What law was these people in the land breaking? Their iniquity, what law were they breaking? So let's look at some of those. Pharaoh. Okay, let's see here. Yeah, so the Canaanites are in the land. We're waiting for them, their iniquity to be complete. But down here in Egypt, off this chart down in here, here's a Pharaoh, a king of Egypt, and he knows God's law, because when he takes a beautiful 60-year-old woman that's still desirable, and he takes her because he understands that Sarah is Abraham's sister, because he told him half-truth. He takes her into his harem, into his palace, and then God sends him these plagues, and he deduces, I have no right to this woman. She belongs to that man. He knows that to take another man's wife is breaking God's law. He turns her loose. Let's go to the next one. Melchizedek. He is in Jerusalem. He's a priest of God Most High in Jerusalem. For him to be a priest, he has to know how to offer the sacrifices. To instruct people, he has to know God's law. So here is a man of God right there. He knows it. He knows God. Then we go to Philistia. The next story is Philistia. Right in here, there's a king there. They call, evidently, their king Abimelech. So the first Abimelech that we have in this story that we're covering is the king there in Gerar, and he also, now she's even older than 60 now, she's past, and so he sees her and he takes her, and God warns him in a dream. And he knows the law, he knows, but he had misunderstood. He had understood that woman was the sister. So when God warns him in a dream, he had kept Abimelech, quote, from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Well, he knew the law. He turned her loose. Now, fast forward 70 more years, and there's another Abimelech on that throne. And now, Isaac comes along, the son, and he's got his wife, Rebekah. And Rebekah is also beautiful. Now, she's a little younger, but she's beautiful. And so this king wants her. And and again, he gets the same story from a fearful man. She's my sister. But when he looks out a window one day and he sees the brother touching the wife, who was the sister, the king deduces that is not his sister, that is his wife. And he calls him in and he said, this would have brought guilt upon us. If I had touched her, it would have brought guilt upon us. Well, guilt only comes when you know the law. You see how they are familiar with these laws of God? So I call these laws the moral laws of God, these basic moral laws of God, by which if a man observes them, he can live. So you see that these people had some knowledge of God and his laws, don't we? Then we go back over here into Egypt again, and here comes another Pharaoh on the throne. And there's going to be this great famine, and God is going to preserve this Pharaoh and his people, and he sends them the great-grandson of Abraham, Joseph. And he goes there and he saves all of this land, and they owe him a lot, so that when Joseph's family comes, this Pharaoh gives them the very cream, the very best of the land, Goshen. And they live and they multiply in that land, and time goes past, time goes on, and a few hundred years pass, and there are a great multitude of people, but there arises another Pharaoh that does not know Joseph. So we're going to cover the Exodus account now, the Exodus account, because there's more than one account in the Bible. And we're going to get some information here, and we're going to get some additional information by another account. Okay, so Exodus account. Exodus 1, Jacob's descendants, they've increased greatly, and this new king arose who did not know Joseph. So he made them slaves. Made them slaves. We're going to see that's breaking that law. Then God sends these 10 powerful plagues. Then Exodus 12 tells us that they had been in the land 430 years by this time. Then God tells in chapter 14 of his great deliverance of these people out of Egypt. They go to the Red Sea, and there's the crossing and the killing of Pharaoh and all of his army. All these amazing signs and powers that God did in protection of his people. Exodus 15, God provides sweet water instead of the bitter water at Marah. Then chapter 16, the Hebrews grumble and complain, and God gives them manna and meat. And then God gave them his Sabbath instruction. But some of them are disobedient. They go out on the Sabbath day, they try to pick up the manna, and they break the Sabbath. Exodus 17, they come to the wilderness of Zin, to Rephidim. And they complain again of water and are given water this time from a rock. And then there's this defeat of Amalek. So you see all of this provision. And then they come to Mount Sinai. But you can't touch it. You can't draw near it, or you will die. So there is no peace, even though God is protecting them, even though God is taking care of them and choosing them, there is no peace between them yet. So Exodus 20 through 23 is where we are. And I call these the bullet points, the first part of the moral law of the bullet points. You love God, and no idolatry. No idolatry. Do you go back into that? Then you have the Sabbath sign between God and these people. And then there is the love your neighbors yourself. And the first bullet points of that. And then after that, God's going to expound more in the next, still in chapters 20 through 23. He expounds what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. So he goes into that. Then in chapter 24, after they've heard all that God has instructed them, everything the Lord has said we will do, and we will be obedient. They agreed to his terms, his instructions, his laws. They agreed to that, and then there's this amazing sprinkling on the altar with this blood offering, this blood of the covenant, and then it's sprinkled on the people, and they're atoned from their sins, forgiveness of their sins, and then there's this amazing picture in 24. The leaders got not only to touch the mountain, they go up, they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet is a pavement of sapphires, clear as the sky itself, but he does not raise his hand against them. They eat and drink in his presence. There's peace now. You see, you agree to the terms of the covenant, then you get forgiveness of your sins, and now you're in this covenant relationship of closeness with this God. Moses then goes back up Mount Sinai. He spends 40 days, and God gives him tabernacle and service instructions for at this tabernacle, that I may dwell among them. Wait a minute. He was just up on the mountain. You couldn't touch it. Then the leaders got to go up there. And now God is going to dwell right in the middle of them. He's going to live right in the middle of them. Amazing. So then he expounds on this covenant sign, how to keep the Sabbath. That's going to be between him and this particular nation. And then chapter 31, when God finished speaking with him, Moses, on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony of the covenant, tablets of stone written by the finger of God. Can you imagine that amazing document with God's signature? Not just the signature, but all of it written by God on these tablets, how precious they were to them. How incredible what Moses had. And then we come to Exodus 32. The people back at camp now had made a graven image. They had turned to idolatry. After everything we saw that God had done for them, they turned back to idolatry, and peace is broken now. That peace that they just had is now broken because God's reaction is, now let me alone that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. He is willing to destroy them and start again with Moses. Moses, though, says, what will the Egyptians say? He intercedes. He stands between the wrath of God and these people who have sinned. He's the intercessor, and he says, what will the Egyptians say? And God changed his mind. While Moses is up on the mountain, God changes his mind. He will not destroy them. So then Moses and Joshua walk down the mountain, and he's carrying these precious, precious stones of this covenant. But when he sees what is happening in the camp, and idolatry is often associated with sexual immorality, and they have turned God's camp into this rivalry and this immoral dancing and evidently sexual immorality in the camp. And when Moses sees it, he takes the stones and throws them down and breaks them and shatters them. And then he has the Levites go in and out among the people, strapping on their sword and killing anybody. It didn't matter who they were, who had been involved in this. Then we come to chapter 33 of Exodus. God will get the job done. He has said he would not destroy them, but he said, I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out all these people that are in this land. For I will not go up in your midst. See, that tabernacle, he was going to dwell, but now he's changed his mind. I will send an angel before you. It will get it done, but I will not go up in your midst, because you are an obstinate people, and I might destroy you on the way. How horrible and how sad. But then in 33:4 through 10 is this incredible scene of repentance. The people take off all their beautiful outfits, and they do not put on their ornaments, and they stand in their doorway, and they can see his pillar outside the camp, and they try to worship this God that they have just made so angry. And all God wants is our repentance, because he changes his mind again, and he says in verse 14, my presence shall go with you, and I will give you rest. And then he calls Moses back up that mountain, and he gives him the second set of covenant stones, and the Sabbath is reinstated between he and this people again. And the tabernacle instructions and the service for this tabernacle are given, and then the tabernacle is then erected. It is set up and everything so that God would dwell in their midst. It's incredible, isn't it? Forgiveness is an amazing thing. After all of this took place, it is then that God has Moses write the book that we call Leviticus. And it is in that book, after what we just read about, that we start reading these do not taste, do not handle, do not touch laws that we've not seen in Exodus. And notice that these are after this great transgression, of idolatry that we just saw. So hundreds of years later, we're going to get a more complete picture of what's just happened. And so if you'll bear with me, I think it will help us to understand, because Paul later will write to another group of Gentile brethren, and they ask a question, why the law then? Why the law then? And he says it was added because of transgressions. Well, what does that mean? The question is, what does the law mean in this Galatians account? What was the transgression? What was the law added? What was added to what? What does he mean by all of that? So, remember the Hebrews were first given the basic laws in Exodus 20 through 23. Didn't say anything about these do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. It was just what I call basic moral laws. You love God, you love your neighbors, yourself, and he gave them the sign of the covenant between he and this nation. Then they sinned, and then Leviticus was written. So to verify all that, we're going to fast forward to the book of Ezekiel. Hundreds of years later, this nation is doing it again. And God is angry, and he has been tolerant, and he is fixing to judge them. He is going to send them into captivity. He's already doing it. Ezekiel's in Babylon, and he's telling why he's fixing to destroy the temple in Jerusalem and everything. So let's see the Ezekiel account. God has inspired this man. Again, we're going to have a more complete account. Ezekiel 27. I said to them, cast away each of you the detestable thing, the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. But they rebelled. Now this is starting back when they're in Egypt, before Moses has gone to lead them out. We didn't read that in the Exodus account, that they were into idolatry while they were slaves. Puts a little bit different spin on the faithfulness of the few God talks about, Amram and Jochebed and the two midwives and all of that. He says, verse 14, then I resolved to pour out my wrath on them and to accomplish my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. We didn't read that in Exodus, did we? At least I didn't find it. But I acted for my name. Okay, so there was another time he acted for his name's sake, and he did not destroy them. This was before Moses, evidently. Ezekiel 20:10. I took them out of the land of Egypt. So there we go. Now we're familiar with the Exodus account. I took them out of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. Now, get your mental picture of what we just read, the sequence of events in Exodus, and let's see what this one says. I gave them my statutes. I informed them of my ordinances by which if a man observes them, he will live. Okay, that's what we first read, Exodus 20 through 23. Those, you love God, you love your neighbors yourself, and expounding upon them. Also, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign. We saw that. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, and they rejected my ordinances by which if a man observes them, he will live. And my Sabbaths they greatly profaned. We read that in Exodus, didn't we? They wouldn't listen to him. They went out on the Sabbath day to pick up that manna. They didn't listen to him. Ezekiel 20:14. Then I resolved to pour out my wrath on them in the wilderness and to annihilate them. We saw that on Mount Sinai. But I acted for the sake of my name, that's what Moses said, that it would not be profaned in the sight of the nations before whose sight I had brought them out. That's exactly what Moses had told him. And God had relented on that mountain. 20:15. Also I swore to them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land which I had given them, because they had rejected my ordinances. Remember what he said? I will send an angel, but I will not go before them. Yet my eye spared them rather than destroyed them, and I did not cause their annihilation in the wilderness. That's that account in Exodus 33 we just read. Because they had not observed my ordinances, my statutes, my Sabbaths, and their eyes were on the idols of their fathers. Remember, this is your God, they said. They had that golden calf. They bowed down to that golden calf and said, this is your God, O Israel. Because their eyes were on the idols of their fathers, in addition, you see that? I also gave them statutes that were not good, and ordinances by which they could not live. And I pronounced them unclean. Why the law then? The people that asked that question knew exactly what they were asking. And Paul understood what they meant. He said it was added because of transgression. And we'll stop right there. When Paul answered that question, the Galatians, why the law then? He said it was added because of transgressions, but he follows up and he says, until the seed would come. So that means there's an insight of these added laws. Whatever was added that he's talking about would cease when Jesus the seed came. So that's another part of the picture, isn't it? Is Paul speaking of all these moral laws? You love God and your neighbor as yourself? To me, that just doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense that all of a sudden, when the seed comes, that's thrown out the window. What I'm going to propose is the distinctive Jewish laws. So that just like your chart, they're given two sets of laws, the Jews only. They're given the moral laws, and they're given additional laws. And so we're going to break those down as we go along, and I think that will really help us. In this context, though, both the recipients of the letter, the ones who had asked the question, why the law then, they knew what they were asking. And Paul knew what they were asking. And we can understand by the context what they're asking. Something had been added, but it was going to end when Jesus came. So let's look at what happened when Jesus came. What did he teach? What did he not teach? Well, he lived under the time of these Jewish additional laws, but he taught only the moral laws. Remember, you love God and your neighbor as yourself. The Sermon on the Mount, go back and look at that. He declared all things clean, so he did not teach the clean, unclean laws because he pronounced them all clean in Mark 7. He healed people on the Sabbath day. He broke the Sabbath according to the Jewish leaders, and he declared himself Lord of the Sabbath, and that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Mark 2. So when Paul told those Gentiles in that original question, in Colossians 2, he said it was having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us which were hostile to us. He took it out of the way. He nailed it to the cross. Was the moral laws hostile to the Jews? That doesn't make any sense, does it? You love God, you love your neighbors yourself. That's not hostile to us. That is not against us. What was hostile to them was the separation laws. It was hostile to the Gentiles. It was hostile in some ways even to the Jews. It was hostile because it was unclean and unclean rituals, and it was do not taste, do not handle, do not touch. If your dead wife dies in the bed beside you, this is what you have to go through. The rest of the world didn't have that. The Sabbath, the covenant sign of Israel, was listed as put on the cross. Not necessarily hostile, but it's put up on the cross. So it's going to be replaced by a new covenant. And then the sacrifices and offerings, the festivals, some of these are Jewish festivals, but sacrifices from Abel on, they're going to be nailed to the cross. They're going to be replaced. And then the sign of circumcision that was given to all of Abraham's descendants through a covenant to Abraham, that also was nailed to the cross. Paul says in Galatians 5, he said, Paul says, every man who receives circumcision, so talking about receiving it as to bind it, he is under obligation to keep the whole law. So let's think, what's he talking about? To bring everybody together now, these Jews and Gentiles, the rest of the world, to bring them together, does it make sense that they're going to have two separate laws like they always did? You're going to have to get rid of these additional laws so that they're all under the same laws. But the Jews, those extra laws, they're going to be nailed to the cross. The sign of their covenant to their father Abraham, that's nailed to the cross, circumcision. The Sabbath day, that was only between the Jews and God, that's going to be nailed to the cross. We're just going to strip it down here, get to the moral laws. Remember what Paul told them? He said, do not let anybody judge you. Don't let anybody judge you in regard to food or drink or festival or new moon or Sabbath days. They were a shadow. They were decrees and regulations like the do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. they were destined to perish. They were never intended to last. Do you see how there's two sets of laws, and some are temporary and some have it in for the long haul? God never intended these extra things that we find to the Jews only to last. It's interesting that when Jesus comes and he's starting to teach only the moral laws, but it's those extra laws that the Pharisees and the scribes had gone to school rigorously to learn, and they were furious at Jesus for breaking these laws. He was touching unclean people. He was healing on the Sabbath day. And to them, their love over these Jewish separation laws were much more than their love for their fellow man, loving your neighbor as yourself. You see how they had that misplaced? Another letter to more Gentile Christians in Philippi, the Apostle Paul talks to those who had put confidence talks about those who had come in among them, and he calls it this time those who had put confidence in the flesh. He said, I was like them. So these Jewish teachers that had come to Christ, and they're trying to bind these separation laws, these ones we just handled that were for Jews alone, he said, I had been like them. He said, circumcised, 8th day, nailed it. Hebrew of Hebrews, I was right at the top of them. As to the law, there's that term again, the law, he said, I was a Pharisee. As to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church. As to the righteousness of the law, okay, there's that term again, the law, blameless. But after coming to Christ, he said, I count it but rubbish. What's he talking about? The moral laws? Is he counting love God rubbish? Is he talking about love your neighbor rubbish? No, he's talking about these additional laws that were added because of their transgression and their sign and their other things. And it's what the Pharisees and the scribes were particularly educated in. Okay, you getting it? Are we? Okay, I see a few heads nodding and the rest of you, woo-hoo. Okay. God inspired in the new covenant more prophets, apostles, and he's going to give them additional information, how he's going to bring Jew and Gentile together. And in particular, his ambassador to the Gentiles, who is the apostle Paul. And so just like what we've been reading, he's going to give them instruction. And it's going to change things up, so God gives him inspired, not only inspired words, but signs and wonders to verify that what he is saying is from God. He's been going around throughout, let me get the map. Okay. No, that's not going to be any good. Sorry. I don't have a map of the whole area. But Paul is going to be going all throughout, above Judea, above Galatia. And he's going to go throughout Tarsus area and the Galatian region, and he's going to go over to Asia, and he'll go to Macedonia and Achaia, all through there. And he's going to be teaching Jews and Gentiles. And he's going to be starting these churches all over. And some, even the churches that he doesn't start, he's going to go through there encouraging. And he's the ambassador to the Gentiles. And it's an amazing story to read. And then he's got these journeys. And after the third journey, he is taking to Jerusalem, where there's been this terrible famine. And he has been inspired to collect money from Gentiles. Gentile brethren throughout all of these that he has been teaching throughout all these regions, and now he is returning with the ambassadors for all of these churches, and they're loaded with this amazing amount of money to take to their Gentile brethren back in Jerusalem and Judea. Now these are the brethren that used to say, you are unclean. You are unclean. Just like Peter said to Cornelius, do you know how unlawful it is for me to enter this house? It had gotten to where they considered anybody that was not Jewish unclean. So these unclean laws had become hostile to the Gentiles because they were unclean to the Jews. It didn't matter if they were God-fearers like Cornelius, that didn't make any difference, or if they were pagan idolaters. They were all unclean to the Jews. You see how those laws would have created this hostility between the two groups? So now his instruction is to bring them all together. So he is bringing all these ambassadors from these Gentile churches, and he comes to Jerusalem. He's trying to get to Pentecost. He wants to convert Jewish. He wants to convince his Jewish brethren that this new covenant with Jesus is the right way now. So he has come to Jerusalem, and all the Gentile ambassadors have taken this money in and set it at the apostle and the leaders' feet, the elders there. And when James sees Paul the next day, he is worried. He is worried because all of these Jews that had first we read off in Acts, the beginning of Acts, where the Jews, 3,000 had turned on the day of Pentecost and more, that's still a little drop in the bucket of all the Jews, okay? And they had turned to Christ, so you had these Jews that were coming to Christ, but now they're going back. They want to keep both sets of laws is what they want to do. And they're going in and persecuting Paul, anybody that teaches otherwise, and they're trying to force the Jew and Gentiles to keep these separation laws put into. When Paul comes to Jerusalem and James sees him, I can just read the fear in James's voice. He said, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are. Thousands now of those who have believed." Talking about Jews. And they have been told about you. They're all zealous for the law. There's that term again, the law. And they have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, okay, the teaching of Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, okay, so Abraham's covenant, and nor to walk according to the customs. So do you see this? In this verse, you have three things: the law, Moses, the teachings of Moses, and the customs. And they're all evidently the same thing. Let's look at the chart. When you read the New Testament, you're going to see terms like this: the law of Moses, the customs of the law. That's what we just saw, didn't we? And we're going to see ancestral tradition, talking about Jewish ancestral traditions, laws of commandments and ordinances, the letters of the law, the written code, and then even the law of sin and death, Paul will call it. That does not sound like laws by which a man observes them, he will live, right? Do you see the difference? These are usually referring to these added laws that are now done away. They're now nailed to the cross. But by the context of anything, you can understand what it means. So it's so important for us to look at the context to understand, is he talking about the moral law and the additional laws, or is he just talking about those things that were nailed to the cross? Okay, pause just a minute. A little bit hard? A little bit hard? It's okay. So let's go back. God told Noah when he came off that ark in Genesis 9, every moving thing that is alive for you shall be food for you. Just like I gave the green plant. So all of those people could eat unclean foods. It's only the Jews that were forbidden to eat that. When the Jews came and God gave them those additional laws, we see that they're not bound on the rest of the nations. So let's get a little more information. Moses told them in Deuteronomy 14, you, talking to the Jews, shall not eat, you shall not taste anything which dies. That's unclean. But you may give it to the alien who is in your town, that he may eat of it, and you sell it to the foreigner. Okay, so the Gentiles, the rest of them, can eat it. You see that? There's a separation here. One group of people could not eat unclean dead things, but the rest of the world could. They had not ever been forbidden to do that. And who are these alien and foreigners? Well, it's not idolaters in the land. He's not particularly talking about that, because the ones that are going to live in the land, we're going to see people that are God-fearers and idolaters live in the land. So whoever is in the land, a Gentile can eat of it. Is that, you following me a little bit? Okay. God allowed, he did not want idolaters in the land. They were to get them out. But we see people like Rahab. We see people like Ruth. We see God-fearing people all over that are welcome to come live in this land. God's not against Gentiles. He's against all idolaters. He doesn't, idolatry. So you have the Gibeonites, you have all these people that we see throughout the Jewish history that could come into the land and they could eat of unclean meats if they chose to. It was just the Jews that were forbidden to eat the unclean meats. So now, in the new covenant with Jesus, you've got this situation of bringing all into one covenant now. Not the rest of the world with the moral laws, and then the Jews with the moral and separation laws. And you're bringing two sets of people that, because of these laws, had been at enmity with each other. Can you imagine how Cornelius felt when he's trying to love and fear God, and the Jews treat him as unclean? I can't come into your house, I can't see you. How that would have brought disdain and enmity between them. And that's not what God meant. That's not what God meant. So this new covenant with the Jews had to end. He made it obsolete, he said, in Hebrews 9. The tabernacle, the gifts and sacrifices, well, why are they? Who replaced them? Who replaced the sacrifices and the offerings? Jesus. Okay. He also, the food and drink and various washings, okay, those things for the Jews. Regulations imposed until a time of reformation, a time of reform. So now it says it is a more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands. Okay, so the tabernacle's no more, the regulations are no more, the Jewish separation, all of that is no more. Instead, today what we have is a tabernacle that's not made with hands. It is a place that God dwells, that we are priests under this great high priest, and we offer up spiritual sacrifices in a spiritual house, a spiritual building, a field, a temple, a tabernacle. All of that is spiritual. So today, everybody is in this covenant with God that obeys him and keeps his laws. Okay, another letter. Another letter to Gentiles is Ephesians. He said that it had these decrees against us that was hostile to us, and he nailed that to the cross, and that's what we just talked about. He is our peace, who made both Jew and Gentile into one. And he broke down the barrier. Thank you. He broke down the barrier of the dividing wall. He broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, and he made the two into one new man, thus establishing peace, and might reconcile them both into one body. So it's not just a physical house, it's also a physical body, a physical church. Physical, I'm saying the wrong thing, spiritual. All of it's spiritual now, so sorry. Into this spiritual body with this one covenant altogether. So it was at that cross that the separation signs, the laws, their feasts, their festivals, their Jewish calendar, all of that was nailed to the cross. And then he broke down the barrier between Jew and Gentile. What does that mean? Well, if a Gentile had come to, like Cornelius, if the Ethiopian eunuch was a Gentile, and they came to worship the God who they served, they could not approach him past a big barrier wall. There was a huge wall that kept all Gentiles out. They could come worship, but they could not approach him. And it had signs on there, if you go past there, the Jews have the right to kill you. Didn't matter if you're God-fearer or not. So they broke down that barrier. See how all these barriers are now being broken down and nailed to the cross? All of these things that would have separated Jew and Gentile out. Okay, so let's go back to our bullet points. Let's go back to your 10 Commandments, and let's see what applies today. No other gods, graven image, not take the name of the Lord your vain. Name of the Lord your God in vain. Okay, those would still apply. Those are part of the moral. The next one is the sign between them and them. And they just said that was nailed to the cross. So the Sabbath, let's put that up on the cross. That does not apply to us today. Let's take the love your neighbor. Honor your father and your mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Not steal. Not bear false witness. Not covet anything that is your neighbor. So then he expounds upon them. You're not to make graven images of gold and silver and all that. That would still apply. So we're not going to cover all this, so don't get real nervous about the next ones. But look at all the things that is expounding upon how do you love God and love your neighbors yourself. Okay, we just covered about God. You were to make these altars, but all of that we don't have to do because who was hung on the cross that became the one sacrifice for us? Jesus. So he replaced all the altars, all the sacrifices, all the offerings. Now he expounds the big time on love your neighbor. And I want us to look at some of these. So Exodus 21:1. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, okay, this is not taking someone from Africa against their will. Let's see what it says. When you buy a Hebrew slave, this is talking about an indentured servant, then this is the way you are to treat him. And he's to be released after so many years. But he is to work to pay off his debt for so many years. Okay. If a man takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food or her clothing or her marital right. Okay. You have more than one wife, you are to treat her, all of them, well. Love your neighbors yourself. You're not to strike a man. If you strike him so that he dies, he shall be put to death. If you set out to kill or murder somebody, you're to be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, okay, this was just a brawl and you got a fisticuffs and you're mad and somebody dies. That's a little different than you don't not to kill him. Okay, but if a man willfully attacks another, to kill him by cunning, then even if you have to take him from God's altar, you are to take him and kill him. Whoever strikes his father or mother. So you're to honor your father and mother. Whoever steals a man and sells him, he shall be put to death. That's what I'm saying. You have no right to, just like the Pharaoh did in Egypt, to enslave people against their will. That's not what it's talking about when you have a slave or an indentured servant. We're going to continue to see that. Okay, if two men quarrel and one strikes the other and he does not die, well, he just pays for his loss of time. But when a man strikes his slave, okay, and the slave dies, he shall be avenged. Okay, if you kill the man that's under you, then you are to die. But if the slave survives after a day or two, he is not to be avenged because he's his money. Well, what does that mean? Okay, we're going to get there in a minute. When a man strives together and hits a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there's no harm. Okay, so these men are in a fight. A pregnant woman's there. She gets hit. She delivers early. There's no problem really to her or her baby. Then he's just to pay a fine, as the judge determines, as the father determines. Keep in mind how you love your neighbors yourself. These are practical applications of the bullet points. So, if you strike the eye of your slave, he is to go free for it. So this slave is trying to pay off a debt that he has stolen or he has gotten into debt, and he has sold himself to pay off this debt. And he is to work it off, but some people are lazier than others, and that you've only got this short period of time to pay off whatever debt it was. And so the master has the right to strike his slave, evidently, to get him to work. That's the best I can say. Now, if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned, but has not kept it in, then the owner shall be put to death, and the ox. If that applied today, I'm just going to tell you, a lot of people are attached to their dogs. If that dog is known for being aggressive to your neighbors, you better get rid of that dog. Because if the laws of the land upheld what God said, if that dog attacked somebody and you knew it had been known to do that, you would be put to death also. This is about loving your neighbors yourself, not your animal. I'm sorry. That's an animal. I don't care. If a thief is found breaking in, okay, so if a thief is found breaking in, he shall surely pay, and if he has nothing, then he is to be sold for his theft. There you go. That is how they got indentured slaves. It's not the same as taking somebody against their will. So it's important for us even to refute. I'm just going to put this in here. When people that we know charge God with injustice and just vile stuff, we need to be able to answer them. It's not talking. God never approved of slavery. These are indentured people that have a debt to pay, and if they're lazy, they can get struck by their owner. Okay, if a man causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed over, then he's to pay for that, your neighbor. If a fire breaks out and it catches in your land and then it goes to your neighbors, you're to make restitution. I get fire permits all the time. All the time. I can do it like a blink of an eye. They even know my name, So, but I have to check before they give it every single time. Are you willing to take responsibility for if it breaks out? Yes, I am. I am. That's God-given laws. A lot of them, see? All right, let's go down. If someone, an owner, comes with his property and let's go down. Sorry, 22:14. If a man borrows anything of his neighbor, he is to make full restitution for it. If he's borrowed, let's put it in today's term. You borrow somebody's chainsaw. If you borrow my chainsaw, you break it, you pay. Like my grandmother used to have in her little shop. You break it, you pay. That's what we should do. But if you hire me to come on your property, and I have my chainsaw and I'm going to cut your tree down, if my chainsaw breaks, that's me. Because you've hired me for me and my chainsaw. Okay, back then it would have been you hired them and their donkey or whatever. Do you get it? It's just practical applications here, dear people. Okay. All right, now he's going to talk about idolatry. Oh, let's skip up. No, let's go to 22:16. If a man seduces a virgin, she's beautiful. She doesn't belong to anybody. And he sweet talks her and he lays with her. Then he is to marry her. But if the father goes, I'm not giving her to that man. No. Then he is to pay the full bride price for a virgin to the father and to her. See how that? If we did that today, we would not have all this. If we upheld to that law, and if he raped her, then he's to be stoned. Okay, 22:18, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. So now he's gone to the idolatry for the first part, love God. Now, the next verse says, whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. And then the next verse, whoever sacrifices to any god. Okay. Talking about idolatry. Idolatry comes, what did I say, from the mind of people. And when we study idolatry has sexual perverse immorality in it. And it includes also animal. So all of these verses he is putting in there about basic laws about idolatry. Now, he goes on back to treating your neighbor, 22:21. You're not to wrong a sojourner or depress him. Okay. You're to not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. And to the poor, you are not to be a money lender to the poor. If your poor neighbor needs something and you can provide it, then don't lend it at interest to him. If you take your neighbor's cloak and pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering. He's poor. You shall not revile God or curse the ruler of your people. Then he talks about the first fruits of God. And even though those laws may not apply exactly to us today, should we not give God our very best and our first? He says, do not spread a false report. Do not bear false witness in a lawsuit. You are not to be partial to a poor man, okay, nor to the rich. You're to be impartial. You're to be fair to everyone. And if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. Everything is about loving your neighbors, even your enemy, even he who hates you. If you see he who hates you is lying down with his donkey, you don't pass on by, well, he hates me. You stop. What a way to bring two people together. What a way to bring two people together. This is how you love your neighbors yourself. You shall not pervert the justice due to the poor in his lawsuit. You shall not bring a false charge. You do not kill the innocent. You shall take no bribe. You do not oppress a sojourner. So see, all of that is just loving God and loving your neighbor. Do you see how it just kind of breaks it down into everyday living? Those first were just simple bullet points, I call them. Now, he says that the Jews had lands and they were to lay it fallow after called the Sabbath. And that was nailed to the cross, those certain Sabbath. But the application applies. The reason for the Sabbath years was so that the land would be there to provide for the poor, that they could come in and harvest that. That should apply to us today. How do we help the poor among us that are willing to come in and harvest it? Interesting enough, you didn't pick your harvest that year and take it to the poor. They had to come in and harvest it. So just a little tidbit there. Then he talks about you're not to make any mention of the names of other gods. And then 14 through 17 is those shadow laws that are nailed to the cross. Y'all doing okay? Take a little break right there. Tie it all together. We're going to go to Leviticus. And we're going to see in Leviticus that God will interweave sometimes these added laws with the moral laws. But one way to separate it out is to see what God judged other nations. He's going to send people to other nations. And when we see what went to those other nations, we see what everybody was under. Does that make any sense to you? Go this way if it does. I know it's confusing still a little bit. So let's go back to Leviticus and see what God says about other nations. Leviticus 18. He said, you, the Jews, are not to do as they did back in the land of Egypt. If you're not to do the laws that they had back in Egypt, then that means what I'd call the moral laws pre-existed, always there. And you shall not do as they did in the land of Canaan. So the people in Canaan had laws that they were under, just like we had said. So there's laws in Egypt, laws in Canaan, you shall not do this. And he's going to tell them what they're going to do. What does that give us? The laws to the Egyptian and the laws to the Canaanites. Do you see that? If he says you don't do what the Egyptians were guilty of, breaking certain laws, the Jews would have those, and the Egyptians would have them. If he says, do not do like they did in the land of Canaan, then that says the Canaanites had these laws, and you now will have these same laws. I'm going to write them down. You will keep these God is entrusting them to the Jews, and we have all these manuscripts today because of the Jews keeping them, because God had them written down. Okay. He says, you shall keep my statutes and my judgments by which a man may live if he does them. Okay? That's the same thing that they had, he says, in Egypt and Canaan. So it's these moral laws, same terminology that he used back in Ezekiel. He says, don't do these things. Do not approach any of your close relatives. And if you look at your book, we're going to go zip, zip, zip. Okay, so all of these people he names. You're not to lie with your family members, your brother, your sister, your mother, aunt, uncle, nieces, nephews. That is a depravity, he says. 18:19, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanness, her period, her impurity. I know this is not taught today, but it's not only right here. We're going to see it again, that this is part of that law. Ezekiel will say it, and he says that you have violated women during their impurity. So perhaps it means you love your wife as yourself. You do not approach her during this time period. I'm just saying, if the Egyptians were judged for it, the Canaanites were judged for it, the Israelites were judged for it, then it's the moral law. It is not the added laws of uncleanness. He's talking about loving your neighbor as yourself. You are not to lie sexually with your neighbor's wife. You are not to offer your children to Molech, profane the name of the Lord your God. You're not to lie with a male as with a woman. So two men together, it's an abomination. You shall not lie with an animal. It is a perversion. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, by all these the nations I am driving out, okay, the Canaanites, have become unclean. Do you see that? These are not the added law. These are the moral laws for all people, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, and the Israelites. For the people of the land who were before you did all of these abominations. Everything we just read, they had been doing that, and now the land is vomiting them out. God is saying their abomination, their iniquity is complete, and this is what they've been doing. All of these things, what we just read, is part of what they have been doing. So if God is judging the Egyptians, if he is judging the Canaanites for it, he's telling the Israelites, don't you fall into this. This is depravity. You cannot do these things that we just talked about. Doesn't mean that it's the first time God ever told people. It's always been there. Notice the words he uses: depravity, abomination, perversion. Our God is not one who changes. If it makes him sick at his stomach for us to do any of these things, it still applies. It still makes him sick at his stomach. So, these moral laws that we're looking at is you love God and your neighbor as yourself versus those separation laws. Okay, he is to revere his father and mother. Then he talks about Sabbath, and that's nailed to the cross. He says, do not turn to idols. That is what he's judging other people for. He said, do these things. He talks about how they were to keep their crops and share it with the poor. Well, we should still do that today. We may not have fields or crops, but we have money. We have provisions that God gave us, so we should give it to the poor today. He tells them what not to do in chapter 11. Do not steal, deal falsely, do not swear by my name. We've already covered a lot of this. You're not to oppress your neighbor. You are not to curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. I will just tell you, I've thought about kids, how they think that's just really funny sometimes. You use this verse to teach your children to be kind to other people, even when they have handicaps and other things, because God says it right here, that this was for all people for all time. He says you are to love your neighbors yourself, and like I said, we're not going to go through them all. He talks about how not to mistreat them. 19:20, if a man lies sexually with a woman who is his slave, okay, if he takes her against her will, they're both to be they shall be put to death if she went along with it. But if not, if it's a rape situation, God already gave that provision. All right, that he's to be put to death. And then it talks about, again, your crops and sharing those with the needy and giving first fruits to God. Idolatry, 19:26. You shall not eat any flesh with the blood. You're not to interpret omens or to tell fortunes. You're not to round off the hair on your temple or mar the edges of your beards. You shall not make cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourself. I am the Lord. You are not to profane by making her a prostitute. Okay? This word prostitute is very similar to the word Rahab. It is idolatrous prostitution. Remember I told you idolatry includes immorality? And evidently Rahab was in the prostitution to her God. And that is why, to me, God always refers to her as this amazing woman of faith who came out of that kind of harlotry. She turned from idols, like Abraham did, to serve the living God. He's not constantly bringing up her sin, but the amazing act of turning away from idolatry. So this prostitution, all of this is about idolatry. So tattooing in this, I'm just going to tell you, tattooing is about idolatry back then. Tattooing today can be other things. It can be about the Lord God. So let's be careful when we judge people who do tattooing today. What do we expect of them? Maybe they did it before they became a Christian, or maybe it's verses of the Bible. It is not talking about idolatrous tattooing, marking of the body. Do you remember at Mount Carmel, they went around calling for God as they cut their idol God, as they cut themselves? Think of that. That's not the same as today. I use tattoos as a way to talk to people, and usually it's something about the Lord. It's interesting. Okay, let's go on. He tells them that they are to keep his sanctuary. So instead of idolatrous temples, they're to revere him and keep his sanctuary. Do not turn to mediums or necromancers, but instead they're to go to the gray hair and honor the face of the old man. If you want wisdom, don't go to the mediums and the necromancers. Idolaters, instead choose the wise, godly people among you to go and ask wisdom from. See how it applies to us today? He says, do no wrong in judgment. We've covered all that. He warns more about idolatry. Anybody who gives his children to Molech, well, is that only for the the Jews? No, anybody. Anybody. Those in Moab, those in the Canaanite country within them, Egypt, it didn't matter where it was. You give your children to Molech, that is against God and against even loving your neighbor as yourself, both of those. And if a person turns to mediums and necromancers and whoring, there's your another, that same similar term, harlotry within idolatry. Doesn't mean that, I'm not saying that prostitution is right if it's not associated with idolatry, because God covers that too. But understand that there is a difference between a woman that's out there, a streetwalker, what we would think today, has nothing to do with religious things. That's not exactly the same thing. They're both wrong. But in these particular, when we're looking at this is talking about idolatry. Okay, then he goes into loving your neighbor, cursing your mother, father, very similar to what we've said before, and how all of this, if you even take your sister, it's a disgrace. If you take a brother's wife, it's an impurity. All these strong languages, if we take people and sleep with them, we have no right to. He says, he winds it up in 2022. Keep all my statutes and all my rules and do them, that the land, talking about Canaan, he's fixing to give them this land, where I am bringing you may live, and it may not vomit you out. You shall not walk in the customs of the nations that I am driving out before you. For they did all these things, and therefore I detested them. Everything he said before, except like the Sabbath, because that's between them Even the Sabbath, like I said, was to take care of your neighbors. If you kept the Sabbath day, the Sabbath each week, it was to let your servant off and your animal off. And it was today of rest. It was to love your neighbors. So that still applies even though it's not a rigid day. When we are employers, we need to let our people off, just like God instructed. That's how you love your neighbors yourself. So all of this was God said. He was judging the very Canaanites for these very things we covered. Do you see how that's an eternal, existing, moral laws? All right. Let's look at the Psalms. We don't want to keep you very long, so let's look at some of the, God will inspire David and Ethan and Asaph and all these others, and let's just see some of that God will have these Jews write down and keep within their synagogues, their tabernacle in the Old Testament, temple, and then later in the synagogues. They're keeping all these written prophetic words of God. So in the Psalms, Psalm 10, full of curses and deceit and oppression and mischief and wickedness and lurking, and he kills the innocent. Eyes that stealthily watch for the unfortunate, lurks to catch the afflicted. That's just lying in wait to do evil to somebody else, isn't it? Vindicate the orphan and the oppressed. That's what we should do today. Vindicate the orphan and the oppressed. But look at, even within these wordings, they may be a little different, but it's still going to reflect what God has been saying. Those who speak falsehood to one another with flattering lips and double heart, and just the groaning of the needy, that should not be charged against me, should it? He says, who may abide in your tent, talking about God's tent, in his dwelling place? He who walks with integrity, works righteousness, and speaks truth in his heart, does not slander, does not take up a reproach against his friend. All of this is just loving your neighbor and loving your God as yourself. He says, do not sit with deceitful men, hate the assembly of evildoers, not sit with the wicked, men of bloodshed, in whose hand is a wicked scheme, men who are full of bribes. 28. The wicked man, those who work iniquity, who speak peace with their neighbors, while evil is in their heart. All of this I still have to work on today. That what I need to condition my heart, that what comes out of my heart and what comes out of my mouth are jiving, and they're kind, and they're good. Now let's look at a few in the Proverbs. Those who say, come with me, come with us and let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent. That's that murderous mentality, or robbers, or all of that. Honor the Lord from your wealth, from the first of your produce. That applies to us today. We may not have this allotted land like the Hebrews did, but we have our wealth, and it came from our God. And we need to share it with other people who are just needful, who are truly needful. Do not devise harm against your neighbor. The crooked is an abomination to the Lord. The Lord hates these things: the haughty eyes, the lying tongue, the hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among brothers. One who spreads strife among brothers. Have I ever been guilty of it? He who mocks the poor reproaches his maker, and he who rejoices at calamity will not go unpunished. And we're going to see that in a minute, how even that could apply what God says about that. He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous, it's an abomination, Lord. Do not rob the poor, and what does it say in 22:28? Do not move the ancient boundaries. If I have a wall between me and my neighbor, and maybe I just want a few more feet, do I covet my neighbor's 2 feet to the right, 2 feet to the left? I've actually had somebody that did that to me. Going to move that ancient boundary and steal 50 of my feet. Don't think it doesn't still happen today. Okay, so briefly we're going to look at what God sent his judges, his inspired mouthpieces, to other nations during the time that Israel is a nation. God is not leaving people without the knowledge. He wants them to repent. So he sends prophets just like he did Noah during Noah's day. He sends prophets with warnings, and let's see what he says. So Amos is sent to Syria, right above Israel. The capital is Damascus. It's also called Aram. Okay, he said, this is what you've been guilty of. You've threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. I want you to see the cruelty. It's one thing to have battles. It's another thing to be cruel. And he's against Gaza because they carried into exile a whole people to deliver them up. He enslaved people to deliver them up to Edom. Tyre, because they also delivered up a whole people to Edom. See, they took these slaves. It's wrong. It's horrible. Edom, because he pursued his brother. Edom, the descendants of Esau. He pursued his brother with the sword and cast off all pity, and his anger toward perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. Do we keep our wrath forever? Ammon, because they ripped open pregnant women just to enlarge their borders. See how it gives us even more information about these moral laws? It's so important to read all of God's word. Moab, because they burnt to lime the bones of the king of Edom. Just excessive cruelty. And then he even, during this same prophet, he sends information about Judah, what they're guilty of. And he says they have lies. They've sold the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They've trampled the head of the poor. One man's father goes into the same man as his son goes in. It's that perversion. It's that abomination. They lay themselves down at every altar. You have made the Nazarites, people who have taken a vow, you have made them drink wine against their vow. He says, you have commanded his prophets, his mouthpieces, saying, you shall not prophesy. You know, when we try to teach somebody today God's words, and they said, don't tell me that, I'm not going to listen to that. Similar. They do not know how to do right. Those who store up violence and robbery, Samaria, who oppress the poor, so northern Israel. They oppress the poor, they crush the needy, they hate him who reproves in the gate and abhor him who speaks the truth. Very much like today. If we try to tell somebody and warn them, they could easily hate us. That's no different than what they did with Lot. You came among us as a judge and among us. Or Moses, when Moses tries to help his brother, what are you going to do? Kill us like you took up for the man yesterday? All right, let's go on. You trample the poor. You exact taxes of grain from him. You afflict the righteous. You take bribe, turn aside the needy. You trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end, and you make the ephah small and the shekel great, and you deal deceitfully with false balances. You buy the poor for silver, and you even sell the shaft. Okay, here they are. They're harvesting their wheat. They're taking it to market, and instead of beating out the shaft, they're filling up the volume, where what can be eaten is maybe a very small amount. Let's apply it today. Let us not be guilty of giving less than what someone is expecting to get for their wear, for their pay. Make sure that what we give them is exactly what we would give to our brothers and sisters. That we treat everybody equally. Obadiah, this is again against Esau, because the violence to you that you did to your brother. On the day that you stood aloft, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were one of them. This verse, I want you to get in your mind, God was raining destruction on evil Jerusalem, evil people. But here is their family cousins nearby. And they are, I'll just go in and take advantage of this. You see, it's one thing for God to judge people when they're wrong, and he's trying to bring them back to down to their knees to return to him. We have no right, because of this verse to say, you got your comeuppance, didn't you? I need to be very careful, even the ones that are in political power that maybe I don't respect or admire. And when something evil happens to them, get on that bandwagon and join all those that are just like Esau did. This verse still applies to me today because it applied to Edom, and that is outside of Israel. That's not the added laws, that's the moral laws. Nahum, he was sent to Nineveh, Assyria. Woe to the bloody city, all full of lies and plunder, no end to the prey. They have heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end, all for the countless whorings of the prostitute. Again, this is the idolatry in their midst. Habakkuk, they're sent to the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Okay? They're not covering the laws that God had given these people. Instead, they're coming up with their own set of laws and their own set of rules. Sometimes our government does the same exact thing, doesn't it? Okay. Violence, they collect captives like sand. They're evil, wickedness, deal treacherously. They offer a sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their fishing net. They continually slay nations without sparing. They have looted many nations. On and on and on. The idols they have and the sacrifice to them. So these are things to other nations, not those separation laws. It still applies to us today. Zechariah, he was sent to the Philistine nation. I will take away its blood from its mouth and its abomination between its teeth. And he said, it too shall be a remnant for our God. So idolatry is what he's talking about, I believe in that. Now, okay, Job. We can get a lot in the book of Job that God inspired within there. Look at what all these people that are not Israelites, they're not of the nation of Israel, and look at what they knew was right and wrong. They had instruction from God, so let's quickly talk about that. Job says, he says, I have not denied the words of the Holy One. He has instruction from God. He knows it, right? He's not left without words of God. He said, 6:14, when his friends have come there and he's not getting friendship, he says, for a despairing man, there should be kindness from his friend. But you would even cast lots for the orphans and barter for your friend. That's a repetitive thing we've seen, isn't it? Is there injustice on my tongue? He says, I've not spoken injustice. Bildad answers back to him, one of his friends. He says, yeah, well, let's think about this. Does God pervert justice? God will not reject a man of integrity, nor will he support the evildoers. Well, that's true. He's just misjudging Job. But he's got it, because God would not do any of those things. Zophar comes along, the one who, all wisdom will die with Zophar. Job will tell him that he thinks he's really, and he's talking about the wicked, and Zophar says, the wicked has oppressed and forsaken the poor. He has seized a house which he has not built. Okay, very similar to what we've been reading. Eliphaz believes Job must have sinned, so he charges Job falsely. He said, you have surely done these things. You have taken pledges of your brothers without cause. You have stripped men naked. From the hungry you have withheld bread. You have sent widows away empty. The strength of the orphans had been crushed. You had to have done these things. But Job had not. So Job answers back. He answers Eliphaz. He said, my foot has held fast to his path, God's path. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the command of his lips. See how he had these instructions from God even though he's not Israelite? I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. Some remove the landmarks. They seize and devour flocks. They drive away the donkeys of the orphans. They take the widow's ox as a pledge. They push the needy aside from the road, so on and so on. He talks about the murderer and the adulterer and all of that. He said, my lips, 27:4, my lips certainly will not speak unjustly. I delivered the poor who cried for help and the orphan who had no helper. Verse 15, I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. So he didn't put those stumbling blocks before them, did he? I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. He was just in the courts. I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched the prey from his teeth. He's not talking about animals. He's talking about people who hurt someone else. We are to always take up for those who are being mistreated. And he said, I did that. Have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? He said, I did all these things. He said, I have made a covenant with my eyes that I would not gaze at a virgin. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's doorway, that would have been a lustful crime. If we all did that today. I made a covenant that I would not. He has a wife. That is the woman he has a right to. He will not look in a lustful way at any pictures, any drawings, no people in anything, because that's wrong. It applies today. Because this is not the separation laws given only to Israel. If I have gloated because my wealth was great, and because my hand had secured much, do I boast how much I have versus my neighbor, as though I wasn't given it the same as my neighbor was given, maybe a meager portion to do with? I think that's just wow. That's wow for me. Have I rejoiced at the extinction of my enemy, or exulted when evil befell him? That's what we talked about earlier. I've got to be careful about who I exalt over, or ha ha ha, you got what you got. If I have looked at the sun or the moon, my heart became secretly enticed, and my hand threw a kiss, see, idolatry, to the heavenly host. I would have denied God above. All of this, so much of this sounds like what we've already been reading, that was given to the Jews to write down and keep. They were to keep it for posterity, for all of us today. We have the written words of God that he gave to the Jews. They wrote it down and they kept it. Micah sums it up in such a great way. He says, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. You love God, you love your neighbors yourself. Okay, that's what God's told us from the very beginning of time. So, we see that all these people had these information. Do you agree that we can see now that other nations had a lot of this basic moral laws? The Jews wrote it down, like I said. You've got Genesis, Genesis through Malachi. They had it scrolls stuck in these scroll arcs throughout their, and so God got them to keep it. They were entrusted with these oracles of God, and that's so great for us today. But did God ever send laws to other nations, and then they wrote it down and kept it? We have the ones that the Jews kept. But what about the Hammurabi Code? Have you ever heard of that? Well, it's 300 years predating when God gave all of these words to Moses, where Moses went back from the very beginning, Genesis 1, and wrote all the history of the world. 300 years before that had happened, there's this Hammurabi Code over in Babylon that we have found. The wording is so similar to what everything we've said. Isn't that interesting? Now, yes, they will have on one of these copies that it is attributed to Marduk, which they say is an idol god. But how long did it take for Israel, after they got these moral laws of God, to turn and bow down to an idol god and say, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt"? How long did that take? And attribute all these words that Moses had given them? 40 days. So can you see that over hundreds of years of time, something that had been given by God of heaven would later be attributed to the God they were serving today? Well, we have these ancient laws. When they are so similar, and they're written so similar, just like what Job had, they came from God of heaven, because an idolatrous God would never say those things. He's not about loving the God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Jesus taught the moral laws. Let's look at them right quick. Matthew 5, do not commit murder, do not be angry. We saw that. Do not commit adultery. Do not lust for her. Whoever divorces his wife except for these certain things commits adultery. You're not to make false vows. Do not resist the evil person. He who acts borrows. You're to love your neighbor and love your enemies. We saw all that, didn't we, already? Nothing new. He says in Luke 6, he said, you're to love your enemies, bless those who curse you, give to everyone who asks of you, treat others the same way you want them to treat you. Love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing. Be merciful, do not judge. Give, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. We've already covered that, isn't it? Like what we talked about in the marketplace. Jesus says to the scribes and the Pharisees in Matthew 23, he said they were hypocrites because they have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. He says, this is a wicked generation. You Pharisees, you're full of robbery and wickedness. Woe to you, Pharisees. You disregard justice and the love of God. So the Pharisees and these other leaders needed forgiveness for their sins. So do we. Paul says in Romans, he is God's mouthpiece. He says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So it is so vital that we understand God's everlasting moral laws and how important it is to follow them still today. Teacher, what is the great commandment of the law? This lawyer came to Jesus in Matthew 22. Jesus answers him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and foremost commandment, and the second is likened to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Then look at what Jesus did, not just what he said, but look at the compassion he showed toward others when he fed 4,000 and 5,000 that were hungry. And he fed even his disciples. He took care of them, and he provided even wine at a hospitality event and took care of them. And then what about the healings that he did for the sufferings, the blind and the lame and all of those that had so many things happen to them? You had people who were paralyzed and deaf and blind and people who had demons in them, and he takes care of them. He helps people who had dropsy. He even puts ear back on in the garden. He does all of this because he has compassion on his fellow man. He lived and he died serving others. He put his neighbor before himself. Hebrews 11 says, through him then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise. Okay, he died on the cross. He is our sacrifice once and for all, and he is our high priest, and we are priests under him offering these sacrifices of praise. Fruit of lips that give praise, thanks to his name, and do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. Okay, 1 Corinthians 13:2 says, I can have all knowledge of his word. So we can study this and have all knowledge of his word. I can give all my possessions to feed the poor. I can give my body to be burned. But if I do not have love for others, it profits me nothing. So let's think. These Pharisees had come in trying to bind extra laws on these new Christians in this new covenant, right? Okay. And we saw how important it was. Paul even calls them dogs in Philippians. He calls them dogs. They're evil workers. They're horrible to add. So I need to be careful what I teach today. Do I teach any additional laws that besides what we have read or what we read in the New Testament, how to come into this new covenant? Jesus died. He gave his blood. We come into the blood of the covenant by what he tells us to do, how we're to come to that blood. We're not going to get into that today, but we're also to keep these moral laws. And we're not to add to, no more than the Pharisees were, the Judaizers that were in the church. They were condemned for doing it. So do I add anything? Am I more concerned about teaching anything perhaps that my group adds on today? Am I more concerned about converting somebody to my group than to this covenant with God? You understand my question? I need to look at my group and say, do we add on anything other than God's word? Because if we do, I don't want to be called a dog. I don't want to stand before God and be condemned because I've added to his word and taught things and bound things on other people that I had no right to bind. So to me, it's very, very important that I see what these laws are, how to enter this covenant, to come in contact with his blood, and then to teach others also. So for me, my prayer, I'm just going to tell you, my prayer is open these blind eyes. Because I was raised learning certain rules and regulations that our group taught. And I bound those for a long time. And I need to be careful what I bind and not bind. So I pray really hard, unblind these eyes. Unmute these ears. Take this callousness away from my heart and my mind so that I can see it the way you intended to. And I pray that constantly before I study his word, because we all can be just as blind as the woe to you scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you Judaizers, dogs within the churches. I have been guilty of a lot of this. That's why it's important to me. I was raised where the rules and regulations were more important than loving your neighbor as yourself. I'm sorry. And maybe you've never experienced that, but I was, by well-meaning people. But the emphasis is on loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. And I may feel a certain way about certain things, but I need to be very careful about binding it if it is not. Thus saith the Lord. May glory be to this great God who has given us this amazing book. And I'm so thankful to it. May we all be a blessing today and from now on. And I hope this has been helpful to you.